Have you ever wondered if everything you celebrate this Holy Week truly honors God, or if knowing this means you are participating in rituals that have been dedicated to pagan gods and demons for thousands of years? What you were taught about Holy Week, which is a consecrated Holy Week commemorating the Passion and Resurrection of Christ, could be a complete distortion of the truth, and most shockingly, what many believe to be worship is actually desecration. Because the truth that very few dare to say out loud is this: Holy Week as it is celebrated today was not instituted by Jesus or his apostles. It was manipulated, transformed, and built by empires that served other gods. Rabbits, eggs, 40-day rituals, processions, all of this has a darker origin than you imagine. This is not just another message. Prepare to discover what the churches don't tell you, what history has hidden, and what has always been before your eyes, because if you think that giving up worship during these dates is synonymous with fidelity to God, you could be unknowingly participating in festivities dedicated to the same gods he hates. The truth has been hidden for centuries, but today it is about to come to light. My name is Israel Bernard, and what I am here to tell today is not a meaningless inherited story or an empty custom repeated by tradition. It is a testimony that burns within me, because although many celebrate a holiday they call Holy Week with rabbits hopping through decorated gardens and painted eggs hidden among flowers, I learned that there was a sacred moment sealed in blood that was violently replaced. Someone, at some point in history, made the decision to exchange the eternal for the superficial, the holy for the symbolic, the true for a distraction. For as long as I can remember, the slain lamb has been for us the emblem of redemption sealed with fire and obedience. Every year when we remember that night in Egypt, the atmosphere changes. It was not a simple tradition, it was the night when God himself descended with judgment, and the only defense for every Hebrew family was the blood on the lintels, the blood of a spotless lamb. It wasn't enough to belong to the people or to intellectually believe in the promises. Visible action was necessary, a mark on the wood that cried out to the heavens, "Here dwells one who obeys." But now I look around and what I find is disconcerting. The streets fill with color, supermarkets display chocolate with long ears, and children, unknowingly, participate in rituals alien to our history. No one explained to them that the sacrifice of the lamb was not a decorative symbol but an act of life or death. At what point did we allow sacred stories to be absorbed by decorations and sweets? Who dictated that it was appropriate to replace the solemnity of Passover with spring games? And why does no one question it? Holy Week as celebrated today by millions has no roots in Mount Sinai or in the instructions given to Moses. It was not taught by the prophets or celebrated by the apostles. Do not appear as a commandment in the Torah, nor was it confirmed by the Messiah. What began as a clear and precise divine order has been camouflaged with elements taken from foreign cultures, religions that worshipped the sun, the moon, fertility, and the earth itself. Female deities with different names but identical intentions infiltrate modern symbols. Even Semiramis, Astara, all of them revered in their day for their ability to conceive, to fertilize, and to represent cycles of death and rebirth. And what do the egg, the rabbit, the equinox, and spring have in common? None of this comes from the blood on the lintels. The most shocking thing is that it was not a simple cultural slip-up, it was a premeditated redesign of a carefully planned system, implemented from the highest thrones of imperial power by decrees signed by emperors who decided that the dates established by God did not align with the interests of the empire. The designated times were modified, commemorations were rewritten, and the most sacred was transformed into a syncretic mixture, a hybrid of the holy and the profane. Why? Because the further we are from heaven's calendar, the easier it is to manipulate us from earth. The question that burns like burning embers in my chest is this: who was responsible for altering the sacred times? Who changed the convocations established since Genesis, inscribed on the eternal tablets, for celebrations that do not appear anywhere in Scripture? How did they manage to impose a new religious system that combines truth and lies, revelation and paganism, and why does that truth remain hidden? It is not taught in temples, it is not mentioned in seminaries, it is rarely heard from pulpits, but it is written. What I am about to do to recount is not a personal interpretation, but documented facts, a web of political and religious decisions that intertwined over the centuries to replace what God had established. History was not told in schools. Most people live trapped in a fabricated narrative, unaware that the dates they celebrate were decided by men, not by the eternal. It all began at dusk. I remember that story from my childhood. The sun was descending toward the horizon, dyeing the sky a thick red, like the blood that would soon be spilled. The hot desert air carried particles of sand that floated suspended, as if even creation itself were preparing for the judgment that was about to come. Inside every Hebrew home, the silence was thick. Families gathered, mothers clutched their children to their chests, fathers looked to the sky, waiting for a sign. Each house was marked. The blood of the lamb dripped onto the wood. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a line between life and death. The promise was about to be fulfilled, but centuries later, that same blood was forgotten, replaced by bright colors for hidden eggs and chocolate figures. Sacrifice was minimized, obedience replaced by foreign customs. Today, when I see the celebrations, I don't find in them the echo of that night in Egypt. I see instead a parade of masks. The truth was covered up, and the world, unknowingly, applauds the Lamb's substitute. I was there that night, a night when time seemed to stand still, when darkness covered not only the sky of Egypt but also the heart of an entire nation. Midnight descended like a heavy blanket, and for a few minutes, the silence was absolute. But that silence was broken by a scream, a long, heart-rending scream filled with such deep anguish that it seemed to come from the core of the earth itself. It wasn't a single scream, it was a clamor that echoed from the cold, sheltered walls of the palaces to the most forgotten corners of the mud and straw huts. The streets were filled with the uncontrollable cries of mothers who found their missing children, the life of parents who fell to their knees before the helplessness of entire families grumbling in the face of tragedy. That night the angel of death walked among us, his step unheard, but his presence felt in every corner where there was no blood of the Lamb. He stood on the threshold there, and when he left behind a void impossible to fill. He made no distinction between rich and poor, between wise and illiterate. Every Egyptian firstborn fell, from the heir to the throne in Pharaoh's palace to the son of the maid at the mill. None were overlooked. God's justice had been carried out with precision. There was no error, there was no mercy where there was no obedience. Every house without the sign was struck. I saw the face of Pharaoh that night. He was no longer the same man who days before had mocked the warnings that arrogance challenged the God of our fathers. His gaze was empty, his shoulders, once erect with pride, now bowed under the weight of inevitable humiliation. His son had died, and with his son, his will was broken. He finally acknowledged what he had rejected for years, that the God of Israel is the one true God and that no one can oppose his purpose without paying a price. That same night, the order came to us, to march. After more than 4 centuries of slavery, entire generations born and died in chains with their backs bent under the Egyptian sun, we were finally free. But that freedom was not accompanied by overflowing joy. It was a freedom bathed in blood, marked by death, covered by the shadow of what we had witnessed. With our tunics cinched, sandals on, staves in hand, and loins ready for the journey, we prepared to leave. We were leaving behind not only a foreign land but centuries of pain and servitude. Passover was born there. Not as a spring festival or a decorated commemoration, it was born as a covenant, sealed between God and his people, a commitment that could not be taken lightly. That night became a perpetual memorial. Not only would it remind us that we were freed from Egypt, but from then on, it would represent the beginning of a direct, intimate, exclusive relationship with the Creator. The covenant was not temporary. It was not just about escaping the Egyptian yoke. It was a living, constant covenant that would guide our steps for generations. God not only freed us from physical oppression, he set us apart for himself. He marked us as his own. He promised us his guidance at every step toward the promised land. The commandment was clear: you will celebrate this night forever. We will teach our children what happened. We will repeat it from generation to generation, not to revive fear, but to keep alive the certainty that our God acts, that he is not far away, that he answers, that he listens, that he intervenes. Thus the years passed, and our descendants continued to remember that night, with unleavened bread and roast lambs, with bitterness in the herbs and solemnity on their faces, because they remembered when death passed by, and life prevailed. But although the ritual was maintained, the understanding of its true meaning began to fade. The words were repeated, but the heart was distracted. They didn't understand that the lamb that had once physically saved our firstborn was only a shadow of what was to come. True redemption had not yet arrived. The blood on the wooden frames was not the end, but a prophetic sign of a greater sacrifice, a blood that would not only cover doors but would enter the very heart of the soul. As time passed, new generations began to introduce strange ideas. What had begun as a sacred celebration began to be contaminated by foreign practices, fertility rites, invocations to foreign deities, symbols that had no place in the worship of the God of Israel. There was talk of a divine child, son of a goddess, whose sacrifice ensured the abundance of the land. Names like Ashtaroth Tammuz were sung, figures that did not come from our scriptures but from the cultures that surrounded us. And the most painful thing was seeing how some Israelites were beginning to adopt these practices, moving away from the faith that once saved us. The prophets rose, men of fire, called by God, raised their voices to denounce what was happening. They shouted in the squares, warning at the gates of the temple, "You are mixing the pure with the profane." But many refused to listen. The comfort of the new, the attraction of neighboring celebrations, they were seduced by what had once been a living commemoration of divine power. Now it was becoming a celebration without content, an empty tradition, and with the arrival of Rome, Passover continued to be celebrated. Yes, but it was no longer the same. The temple in Jerusalem, which should have been a beacon of purity, was corrupted. Commerce had invaded the sacred courtyards. Religious leaders had become allies of imperial power. The Pharisees and the Sadducees administered the festivities as if they were political events, seeking prestige rather than sanctity. Amidst all that hypocrisy, no one realized that the true Lamb was already walking among them, the one who had been announced for centuries, the one who was coming to fulfill, not to repeat. Just as in Egypt, before liberation, there must have been darkness, betrayal was approaching, judgment was imminent, shadows were gathering. The clamor of Egypt was about to be repeated, not with the cry of the firstborn, but with the groan of all creation at the surrender of the Son. I grew up listening to the warnings of the prophets, those voices crying out in the midst of the spiritual desert of Israel, reminding us that what we had received was sacred, immutable, eternal. But over time, the hearts of the people leaned toward what seemed more attractive, more comfortable, more similar to what neighboring nations offered. Paganism did not come with violence or threats. It presented itself as a sweet poison disguised as wisdom, spirituality, aesthetic beauty, and it was precisely during the time of the judges that Israel, now without a firm or central guide, began to stray. The land was divided, everyone did what seemed right, and in this spiritual confusion, a fascination with foreign gods arose. It was then that I saw how many of my brothers began to worship Baal and Astarte, names that resonated in the Canaanite hills but hid a darker undertone. These names, which seemed new, were nothing more than disguises for ancient entities. They were Canaanite versions of Nimrod and Semiramis, figures that embodied the primitive rebellion against the Creator, the same rebellion that had begun at Babel when humanity decided to build its own path to heaven. Under these new names, the Israelites offered incense, built altars, and celebrated festivals that were not ours. The worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob began to mix with ritual dances, with foreign songs, with practices that had nothing to do with the Torah, and the most tragic thing is that this inclination was not temporary. During the era of kings, when Israel was to consolidate itself as a nation of light, idolatry became institutionalized. It was no longer held in secret or on makeshift altars on hilltops. Now it was part of the system. High places were built in every city, sacred pillars were erected. Even the temple in Jerusalem, the house where the name of our God was to dwell, was defiled. There, lamps were lit, not for the Eternal One, but for the Queen of Heaven. There were women weeping for Tammuz, remembering his death as if he were a false Messiah, while the true words of the prophets were ignored. Songs of worship were mixed with laments for foreign deities. The incense rose like this, but its fragrance was not pleasing to the Creator. The Passover, which had been established with such solemnity in Egypt, began to lose its meaning. What was supposed to be a reminder of God's power and His miraculous intervention on behalf of His people was gradually distorted. Although the date continued to be marked on the calendars and although many continued to prepare the lamb, the heart of the celebration was no longer in what God had done. For many, it was just a routine. Words were recited, steps were followed out of tradition, but the spiritual vigor had evaporated. What was supposed to be a living commemoration became an empty ceremony. In the midst of this atmosphere of confusion, the temple in Jerusalem, the spiritual center of the people, ceased to be a refuge for the soul. It became a marketplace, a plaza of interests. The priests grew rich with the offerings of the people. Corruption was disguised as religiosity. Hearts were far from God, even though their lips spoke His name. And then a new transformation was approaching, an even deeper one that would not come from within Israel but from outside, from a power that dominated with force and cunning. When Rome extended its borders and its influence reached every corner of the known world, it also brought with it a religious system that did not erase conquered beliefs but absorbed them. Rome became a new Babylon. Its emperors understood that it was more effective assimilating what to destroy, and so the local deities were reconfigured under Latin names, their rituals adapted, their festivals reformulated, and when Christianity began to grow within that system, it was not allowed to flourish in its original purity. It was molded in the early centuries. The followers of Christ celebrated Passover faithfully. They recognized in the sacrifice of God's Lamb the fulfillment of the promises made to Moses, to the prophets, and to the entire people. They added no symbols and did not change the dates, but soon, the leaders in Rome decided to make adjustments. They wanted this new faith acceptable to the multitudes who still clung to their old customs. They then took the celebration of Passover and replaced it with a more palatable version. Holy Week set a new date to commemorate Christ's resurrection. It was no longer to be observed on the 14th of Nisan according to the biblical calendar. Instead, it was established that it would be the Sunday after the first full moon of spring, a day sacred to the sun god. Thus, the connection with God's calendar was erased. Elements that had never belonged to the gospel were introduced. The customs of the cults of Tammuz and the queen of the processions with carved images subtly filtered into the sky. Days of mourning that extended for 40 days. What ancient civilizations had called mourning for Tammuz was adopted as Lent. It was no coincidence. Every step was calculated. The pagan figures carved in wood and stone that once led festivals honoring false gods now led religious processions under Christian names. The story of the divine Son who dies and rises again was mixed with ancient legends to the point that it was difficult to distinguish where the truth ended and the invention began. Despite warnings, the people of God accepted this mixture without protest. They accommodated themselves to the fusion. They forgot that the Eternal's festivals were eternal, not subject to modification by human decision. Only a few resisted silently, hiding in catacombs. Those faithful continued to celebrate Easter as the apostles did. They did not accept the new version. They were called heretics, persecuted, expelled, but they did not surrender. This is how the true Passover was relegated to the corner by institutional pressure, drowned by alien rituals. The original meaning of the sacrifice was distorted. Babylon had fulfilled its mission. The pagan teachings were integrated into the worship of the true God, but history was not yet over. Because although darkness covered much of the path, a small light still burned, weak but alive, hidden but not extinguished. A remnant persisted, determined to uphold the truth even if the whole world turned in the opposite direction. The plan to mislead humanity was broader. The distortion of Passover was not an isolated error, it was part of an orchestrated strategy, at the center of which was the figure of a false lamb, an impostor dressed in light, who presented himself as the path but led to darkness. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, under the cold, white light of the moon, a dinner was being held, a simple but unique dinner in a room secluded from the bustle of the city. Jesus of Nazareth, the teacher who had traveled through villages proclaiming the kingdom, was meeting with his disciples. Were celebrating Passover. and on the table, among the bread, yeast, bitter herbs, and red wine, the true Lamb was about to reveal the hidden meaning of everything we had celebrated for centuries without understanding that night. One the disciples would never forget. Passover ceased to be just a memory of what our ancestors experienced in Egypt and became the revelation of an eternal plan that had been hidden for generations. Jesus, with a slow and solemn gesture, took the bread in his hands and held it for a few seconds in front of everyone. His deep, serene gaze rested on each one, as if he wanted to record that moment, in everyone's heart. It wasn't the gaze of an ordinary teacher, it was that of someone who knew they were about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. Then, gently, he broke the bread. The crunch of the bread as it broke in his hands was the only sound for a few seconds in that room so full of expectation that one could barely breathe. "This is my body, given for you," Jesus said in a firm but tender voice as he distributed pieces of bread. What he said disconcerted us. We had never celebrated Passover in that way. The unleavened bread had always been there, along with the lamb and the bitter herbs, but never as a symbol of his own body. We didn't clearly understand the meaning of his words, but we knew that what was happening was momentous, as if the hidden meaning of centuries of history was finally being revealed. The silence that followed was filled with unasked questions from puzzled looks and troubled hearts trying to comprehend what was incomprehensible. Then with the same solemnity, Jesus took the cup, lifted it firmly, and held it high. The dark wine gleamed, under the light of the oil lamps. His words rose above the murmur of the city and pierced our souls like arrows. "This is the new covenant in my blood, shed for the redemption of many." A wave of confusion swept through a new covenant in his blood. Everyone looked at each other for answers in each other's faces, but no one dared to speak. Until that moment, Passover had always been the memory of the lamb slain in Egypt, the symbol of a blood that saved our firstborn. But now Jesus was saying that all that was nothing more than a shadow, a preparation for what was about to happen, a superior sacrifice, definitive, sealed with his own blood. While we were still processing his words, a different kind of attention began to take hold of the atmosphere. Something was moving in an invisible. We felt something dark looming over the room. A shadow had sat down between us, silent but dense. I could see the restlessness in everyone's eyes, but especially one, Judas Iscariot. His gaze avoided ours. His fingers nervously played on the edge of the table. He wasn't eating, he wasn't speaking. Something inside him was breaking down. Jesus knew it. He didn't accuse him with shouts or reproaches, he just raised his gaze. He left the cup on the table and looked at us one by one, before uttering a sentence that froze our hearts. "One of you is going to betray me." The air became heavy, the silence unbearable. We froze, our faces paled. We all began to ask ourselves with fear, "Is it me, Lord?" Doubt, fear, and anticipated guilt took hold of us. Judas remained silent. Finally, with a trembling voice and a rehearsed gesture of innocence, he too asked the question. Jesus didn't rebuke him publicly. He just leaned toward him and, with restrained sadness, whispered, "What you must do, do quickly." Judas stood up immediately, without looking at anyone, without saying goodbye. The night breeze blew through the door as it opened, and we saw him leave, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the cobblestone alleys of Jerusalem. Inside him, a battle was raging, but the metallic clinking of the 30 coins in his purse drowned out any remaining consciousness. Outside, the high priests and Pharisees were already waiting for him, the same ones who had been planning Jesus' death for some time. The pressure was intense, both religious and political. The leaders of the people feared that Jesus' growing fame, his power over the crowds, his dominion over spirits and illnesses, would spark an insurrection that would put Rome on alert. But his motivation went beyond the political. They hated him because he had exposed them, spoken out against their hypocrisy, unmasked their corruption. He was not afraid to look the powerful in the eye and speak the truth. He was a threat to the system that they had built to maintain their power. Jesus had to die, but not just any death. His execution had to be carried out precisely before the Sabbath so that it wouldn't interfere with the Passover celebrations or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The plot was carefully planned. They disguised it as justice and manipulated the people's opinion. They presented Jesus as a danger to the nation. They never imagined that by trying to eliminate him, they were fulfilling exactly what the scriptures had prophesied. As dinner drew to a close, Jesus spoke to us with overwhelming tenderness. He knew what was coming. He knew the anxiety that would overcome us. He warned us that trials would come. One of us would deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed, but he also assured us that his surrender would open the doors to salvation. He told us, "In the world, you will have tribulations, but take heart, I have overcome the world." His words hung in the air. We heard them, yes, but we didn't fully understand them. No, not yet. The night continued its course, taking us ever closer to the decisive moment. We left the place where we had dined and headed toward the orchard, the Garden of Gethsemane. The city was still celebrating, but in that secluded corner, only the whisper of the wind among the olive trees could be heard. Jesus stepped aside to pray. The sweat running down his forehead fell to the ground like drops of blood. He knew the hour was approaching. His words were deep laments, cries to the Father. We, a few steps away, struggled against sleep. We didn't know that every minute of carelessness was one more piece of the inevitable destiny that awaited us. Suddenly, everything changed. Hurrying, flickering lights advanced along the path. Armed shadows emerged. Among the trees, a procession of soldiers, accompanied by priests and town elders, burst into the garden. Judas, with determination, stood before them. He was distraught. The internal struggle had left its mark on his expression. He approached Jesus and with feigned sweetness greeted him with a kiss on the cheek. That was the sign, the traitor's kiss. Jesus didn't resist, his body didn't tense. He just looked at him and said, with a voice that still resonates in my soul, "With a kiss, you deliver the Son of Man." Judas didn't respond. He lowered his gaze. He couldn't bear the purity of those eyes. Peter, impulsive as always, he drew his sword and, in an attempt to protect the Master, cut off the ear of one of the high priest's servants. But Jesus, even at that moment, reached out, touched the wound, and healed it. "Put away your sword," he said firmly, "for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." And so the true Lamb was delivered without resistance, without complaints, like one who knows he is fulfilling the highest purpose that has ever existed amidst the chaos that broke out in the Garden of Gethsemane when the Roman soldiers, guided by the religious leaders and headed by Judas, burst into the darkness of the night. Peter reacted with his characteristic impetus. I saw how he quickly drew his sword, driven by the desperation to protect the teacher. He lunged at one of the high priest's servants, cutting off his ear. The wounded man's cry of pain broke the tense silence of the garden. The violence was about to escalate. The atmosphere was filled with a dense electricity as if a battle were imminent. But in the midst of that storm, Jesus did something unthinkable. He did not flee, did not raise his voice, did not invoke angels, did not order resistance. He extended his hand toward that wounded man and with superhuman calm, touched him and healed him instantly. There was no trace of the wound, only a stupefied silence. Then, turning to Peter with a firm gaze and a calm voice, he said, "Put away your sword, for those who come by the sword will perish by the sword." At that moment, it became clear that there would be no struggle, no combat, no resistance. His surrender was voluntary, as deliberate as that of a lamb that, if it didn't submit, made its way to the altar of sacrifice. Jesus wasn't taken by surprise. He knew exactly what was coming and accepted it with the dignity of one who knows the purpose behind the suffering. He walked into the trap set with a peace that didn't come from this world. From the moment he was captured, a series of events began, marked by injustice, illegality, and corruption. According to the law of Moses and the rules of the Sanhedrin, no trial was to be held. At night, however, Jesus was taken under cover of darkness, first before Annas, the ex-Hume priest who, although he had officially left office, still held great influence among the religious leaders. Annas looked at him arrogantly, seeking to break his composure with leading questions and accusations, disguised as interrogations. Their intention was to provoke a response that could be used as evidence, but Jesus didn't fall into their traps. He remained firm and wisely silent. When he got nothing useful, Annas referred him to Caiaphas, his son-in-law, the acting high priest. The Sanhedrin was already meeting in secret in Caiaphas's house, an assembly convened illegally with a single purpose, to sentence Jesus to death. False witnesses were presented, but their statements were contradictory and baseless. There was no obvious crime. Then, frustrated and enraged, Caiaphas stood up, tearing up the rules of due process and shouted, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus, who until that moment had remained silent, raised his gaze. The room held its breath. His voice was clear and without trembling. "You have said it. From now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." These words unleashed Caiaphas's uncontrolled rage. With a theatrical gesture, he tore his clothes and exclaimed furiously, "Blasphemed! What further need have we of witnesses? He is worthy of death." The verdict was sealed not by the evidence but by the decision that had already been made before the trial even began. However, there was an obstacle. According to Roman law, the Jews could not carry out a death sentence without the governor's approval. Therefore, as dawn broke over Jerusalem, Jesus was led before Pontius Pilate. Pilate was a man hardened by power. He was accustomed to passing sentence without flinching. When he saw Jesus, he heard the accusations of sedition and proclaiming himself king, but something inside him was disturbed. He questioned Jesus and asked him directly, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus calmly replied, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate was impressed. He didn't see a rebel or a troublemaker in him. He found no fault worthy of death, but the crowd was agitated, manipulated by the priests. Cries for his crucifixion grew violent. To resolve a dilemma, Pilate sent him to Herod, who was also in the city. Herod, more curious than justified, wanted to see a miracle. He asked him mocking questions and mocked him, but Jesus didn't say a word. He didn't defend himself. He didn't respond. Herod, frustrated, sent him back to Pilate. The governor faced the clamor of the people in an attempt to calm the crowd. He proposed releasing Jesus according to the Passover tradition, which freed a prisoner. However, the crowd chose Barabbas, a criminal. Nevertheless, Pilate didn't give up. He ordered Jesus to be flogged, hoping that this punishment would be enough to calm the crowd. The Roman soldiers were vicious and beat him mercilessly and placed a crown of thorns on him. They dressed him in a purple robe and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they shouted as they spat on him and beat him. When Pilate presented him before the people, bleeding and battered, he thought his appearance would arouse passion, but he was wrong. The cry that arose was even louder, even more determined, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate, seeing no way out, made a symbolic gesture. He washed his hands in front of everyone as if he could thus absolve himself of guilt, but that water did not wash away the responsibility of having handed over an innocent man, giving in to the pressure of a corrupt system. He handed Jesus over to be crucified. Thus, religion was used as a weapon of power, justice was perverted, and the truth was condemned. The trial was over. But the tragedy had only just begun. When the sun had not yet fully risen, Jesus was forced to carry his cross through the dusty streets of Jerusalem. A crowd followed him. Some wept in silence, others insulted him, unaware that they were witnessing something greater than the death of a man. They were witnessing the most profound sacrifice history has ever known. Upon reaching Golgotha, the soldiers laid the skull on the Cr.